Hey everyone, Mark Yerkes here, continuing our exploration of obscure Christian history. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at Albania's troubled history. In particular, the repression of religion, which took place for 5 decades under communist dictatorship following World War II, and the transition from forced atheism to restored religious freedom, which has taken place over the past 30 years. So stick around. Albania is a bit off the beaten track of tourism. It is across from the heel of Italy's boot, separated by the Adriatic Sea and north of the more popular nation of Greece. But there is much to be admired about this country. Its Adriatic coast has some spectacular cities that have been discovered by both seasoned and budget travelers who recognize a bargain when compared to other Mediterranean destinations. And the hiking trails and scenic beauty of the mountains is just a short distance away. Tirana, the capital, is a growing city with many of the conveniences of other European countries. New buildings are under construction, infrastructure is undergoing improvements, and Albanians seem hopeful about the future. But despite appearances, there are still rough edges and visible scars from the past. Most of the scars are from wounds suffered during the World War II Italian and German occupations, followed by the communist rule of dictator Enver Hoxha, whose regime did not crumble until 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and a few years after his death. Many still argue that the severity of the communist rule of Hoxha and his elites was far worse than that of former occupiers. So how did this come about? Much of the organized resistance to the fascist Italians and Nazis came from communist partisans, and when the war ended, the Balkan countries naturally gravitated towards communism. Marshal Tito became ruler of Yugoslavia and held this union of disparate people groups under his control for decades. But Hoxha did not agree with Tito's view on communism, preferring instead to follow the example set by Joseph Stalin. Hoxha not only purged Albania of his rivals, he even had friends from the past and his own brother-in-law executed. He became increasingly paranoid, and to maintain control of the people, he implemented a surveillance state throughout the nation that kept average Albanians in fear.
Step by step, the communist systems try to install new concepts for the new human, new personality in the people. Of course, you have not the right to speak. Normally you have not the right to think first. And if you have not the right to think, of course, you have not the right to speak.
Within the city center, one can visit sites that demonstrate just how real this paranoia was. One attraction is the House of Leaves. This museum sounds innocent, but in fact the name is deceptive. The old brick building covered with ivy appears pleasant enough. It began as a maternity hospital, but it became the Nazi headquarters during World War II, and later the center for surveillance activities under the Hoxha regime. Figures painted on the street-side wall suggest its more sinister purpose. Coordination of all surveillance activities on the Albanian public were done from this building. Its rooms, some of which had been used for direct interrogations of suspects, are now filled with the old spying equipment used to tap phone conversations, secretly take photos, and plant microphones that were hidden in everyday objects.
Nowadays, everyone knows that mobile phone or other equipment, electronic equipment, are a type of collecting information. Information is power, The key of the to be a winner of a war is to get some information, extra information.
But the communist government did not rely entirely upon electronics. Their most valuable assets were human. Friends, family, neighbors, who would spy on those closest to them in order to gain some material advantage, or to prove their loyalty so that they might not become a target themselves. Accusations were enough to get a person sent to a work camp or prison. One poignant room contains panels hanging from the ceiling on which are written the names of thousands of Albanians who were tortured and killed. Testimonies to the atrocities are played within the museum and come from those who survived or their family members. One such witness is Fatos Çoçia.
In 1951, my father went to prison for his political beliefs. They imprisoned him for 2 years, and then he was released. That system was horrible. It was like Albania was in the Holocaust for 50 years. I can say that the communists were like bad seed, like rabid dogs, like terrifying wolves. We people who lived in that system, we know how bad it is. But many people do not.
Ju flet Tirana, të dashur dëgjues, mirëmëngjes. Po fillojmë transmetimin e emisioneve tona.
It seems that Hoxha was not only fearful of resistance from within Albania, but also from outside. He used forced labor to build about 750,000 bunkers against possible invasion from land and sea. The majority of these bunkers are located along the coast and along the land borders, but they can also be found in the most unlikely places, like public parks and empty fields. Tirana has 2 extensive bunker complexes that have been turned into museums. Bunkart 2 is located near Skanderbeg Square amidst government buildings. It contains passages leading to these buildings as a means to escape aerial bombardment. Tourists can pay a small entrance fee and explore the bunker complex, which contained everything from private rooms to dining halls to decontamination chambers and communication rooms. The real question is, who did Hoxha fear would invade? He claimed that he was defending against the United States, but historians believe that this was just an excuse. His real fear was Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union. That's right. History proves that a tyrant's greatest fear is other tyrannical governments or his own subjects. Building bunkers served 2 purposes: protection from external forces and spreading his paranoia to the population so that they might more easily accept their isolation from the free world.
I hope you're able to hear this okay. I'm standing right on a main road, so there's a lot of traffic. I'm standing in front of the house of Enver Hoxha, who was the ruler of Albania from 1945 to 1985, where upon his death the country was taken over by his right-hand man for another 5 or 6 years until communism ceased to exist here. The house is still open but abandoned. There's nobody living here. It has not been turned into a museum, and there's no decision on what is going to be happening with the house because there's still so many people who are related to Hoxha and to the government still living in Tirana that are resistant to a lot of the changes that might be made otherwise. So I'm going to meet you a little bit further down the road. We are in the area called Beloku, which means the block. And there's a reason it's called the block, which I'll explain a little bit later on.
In truth, even a dictator is a prisoner. Personal security requires isolation within a safety zone. It might be luxurious and have many conveniences that others do not possess, but a gilded cage is still a cage.
Behind me is a typical building from the period when communism first came to Albania. As you can see, it's an older building, still in a little bit of poor shape. It is only 4 stories. I think the maximum is about 5 stories of a building, because the idea was that everybody should have the same. Everybody has an equal share in the communist state.
But, of course, this was not true. Most people could not live in such a place. They either could not afford it, or they could not get permission to have an apartment, especially in Boloku. Boloku was Hoxha's gilded cage, an approximately 3-block by 3-block area within the city that was completely surrounded by security and military personnel. Only those with clearance could get past the heavily armed checkpoints and bunkers. It contained several villas built by Italians prior to the war, and these were now occupied by Hoxha, his immediate family, and by the families of his highest officials in the government. Other government officials and the well-connected might be allowed to live in some of the apartments within the area, but the situation was by no means stable. One day they might be given a free television set and other perks that the common people were forbidden to enjoy. But the next day they might be kicked out onto the street, or even worse, sent to a prison or work camp without explanation. If surveillance was strict upon the general population, it was even more so within Boloku. Every phone conversation was recorded, every building was bugged. No one was above suspicion. Clergy were high on the list for suspicion. Religion has always been a threat to communism because it claims a higher authority than the state. It sets a standard of moral conduct that is often in conflict with the state. In 1967, Hoxha authorized a complete suppression of all religion in order to bring about a truly atheistic nation. Churches and mosques were demolished or turned into facilities more useful to the Albanian government, such as warehouses. Few survived the purge.
In the northwest, the communists started with a war against the priests. Step by step, they spread this kind of war around the country, even for the Muslims, for the imams, for the priests of Orthodox, for all type of religions.
Hoxha realized that if he eliminated the restraints of religion, he could justify anything. Of course, he was creating a religion of his own. People do not often stop to think that communist atheism is a form of religion. It has a set of core beliefs that must be adhered to. It has its own sacrifices by surrendering oneself to the collective. It creates its own God in the image of the state or the supreme ruler over the nation who holds the power of life and death. This God could be benevolent to the useful, obedient subjects, and would be vengeful against those who were not. But this God is not the God of the Bible. It is the God of this world system.
After the year 70, 75, probably almost all the people in the country have been convinced that this kind of system cannot change, because you have no other choice. The answer was clear: to go in prison, or to lose the job, or to be discriminated, to move from the city to faraway village of the country.
By the time of Hoxha's death in 1985, almost the entire nation was fully subservient to this new faith without substance. It was as though everyone was psychologically afflicted with Stockholm Syndrome, a delusion that makes a person love their victimizer. The Skopje Pyramid was built as a museum and memorial to Hoxha, but after the communist government fell in 1991, it was closed and fell into disrepair. People were divided on whether to tear it down or to renovate it into something else. A decision was finally made to reconstruct it as a public space containing a tech hub, commercial space, and a digital learning center. It has been under construction since 2021, but is this out of respect for the future or for the past? Is it just coincidence that the final approval for this project did not come until after the revived Socialist Party became the majority in Albania's parliament?
That economy is the key of things. After the, let's say, people of communist system lose the power, they go underground in hidden way to get the power of economy, of capitalism. So they have the possibility and they have the support just in the beginning of the years of the democracy of new system to control and to get in the economy. But having the economy, you have the money. Having the money, you have the power. So in other forms, indirectly, they get again in the power.
Yet even now, the few remaining statues that praised leaders of the communist movement have been relegated to a porch in the back of a Tirana art museum. One has to make a special effort to locate them. Many people want to forget the past. The younger generation never experienced it. But there is at least one community of young and old who choose not to forget. On a cold and wet November afternoon at Skanderbeg Square, I joined a gathering called together by the Evangelical Alliance of Albania, which consists of about 200 churches nationwide.
Yes, hello, this is Pastor Gentian. This event is the 30 years of anniversary after the 40 years when Albania was closed for the gospel. So we celebrate the 30 years of the church, of the coming of the gospel to Albania. So this event is a celebration of the 30 years of church planting, church work, missionary work to Albania, and we celebrate for that. On the 14th of November, it's a historic day for us as an Albanian Evangelical Church in Albania.
Considering the weather, there was a good turnout. Christians are especially aware that religious freedom ought to be guarded and cherished.
Amen. Hallelujah. Jesus is the Lord. If you express this word in Albanian communist time, you will put to prison 25 years only for that saying that. We are the last domino of all ex-communist nations or states. After the Berlin Wall, we are the last domino that fall in the Balkans. So, praise God, we are free to worship Jesus and we are free to believe in God. Thank you.
It is ironic that the magnificent Resurrection of Christ Orthodox Cathedral in Tirana is directly across the street from the House of Leaves. It seems particularly appropriate that a bastion of government surveillance should now be under the watchful eye of the Church. Hopeful that in this case, history will not repeat itself.
As I ponder the history of Albania, I am reminded of how quickly life can change. The coronavirus pandemic has proven how easily we may find ourselves in financial, physical, social, or political upheavals over which we have no control. But as Christians, we do have a choice. We can choose to go with the flow and be tossed about in the turbulence, or we can choose to swim upstream, against the odds, in spite of the circumstances, remaining steadfast in our faith. The choice is ours, but we should not be complacent and wait until we are forced to make a decision. We should make the decision now, so that when tested, we're not caught unprepared. The day may come, and perhaps very soon, when those who profess Jesus Christ as Lord will be persecuted, maybe even unto death. What will your decision and response be? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did so, please give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell. Until next time, may God bless.